The auctioneer barely finished saying the price before the room erupted in laughter. $2,000 for that? Someone near the back actually laughed out loud. Another man shook his head and whispered, "That boy doesn't know what he's doing." And standing alone near the front of the crowded auction hall was 26-year-old Caleb Miller, holding the deed to a farm everyone else had spent the morning trying to avoid. The land had no working irrigation. The farmhouse had broken windows. Half the fences had collapsed. And according to 3 different ranchers in the room, the soil was so poor that nothing worth growing could survive on it. Yet Caleb had just spent nearly every dollar he had saved over the previous 4 years buying it. What they didn't know was that Caleb hadn't bought the farm because of what he could see above the ground. He had bought it because of something he had noticed beneath it. Something so strange that the previous owner had mentioned it only once before, suddenly refusing to discuss the property again. And Caleb had no idea that before the night was over, he would discover evidence that someone had deliberately hidden something on that farm decades earlier. Something they never wanted found. 3 months earlier, Caleb Miller had been working as a farmhand for a wealthy landowner outside the small town of Red Creek. He wasn't famous, he wasn't wealthy, and he certainly wasn't experienced enough to impress the older farmers who had spent their entire lives working the land. But Caleb had something they underestimated. He paid attention. He noticed things other people ignored. That was why, when he first heard that the old Miller farm was going up for auction, he became curious. The property had been abandoned for almost 12 years. The previous owner, Walter Hayes, had died without children, and the farm had slowly fallen apart. Nobody wanted it. The local farmers said the land was cursed with bad luck. Others said Walter had simply been a terrible farmer. But there was one detail that caught Caleb's attention. Every description of the property mentioned the same thing. The farm had a dry well behind the barn. Not unusual by itself. What was unusual was that Walter Hayes had spent a fortune repairing that well shortly before abandoning the farm. Why would a man spend thousands of dollars repairing a well that had already gone dry? Caleb couldn't stop thinking about it. So one evening he drove past the property. The gate was hanging crookedly from one hinge. Tall weeds covered the fields. The old farmhouse looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. But then Caleb noticed something. Near the barn was a patch of ground where the grass was noticeably greener. It wasn't large, maybe 20 feet across, but everywhere else around it was dry and yellow. Caleb stopped his truck. He stared at the patch. Then he looked toward the old well. The two were almost perfectly aligned. That was the moment his curiosity became something else. He got out of the truck and walked toward the fence. There, partly buried beneath the weeds, he noticed a rusted metal marker. Most people would have walked straight past it. Caleb didn't. He pulled away the grass. There were 3 faded numbers scratched into the metal. 17, 4, 9. He had no idea what they meant. But when he asked an older farmer in town about them, the man's expression changed. "Where did you see that?" "On the Hayes property." The farmer stared at him for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "Forget you ever saw it." That answer only made Caleb more curious. "What does it mean?" The old farmer shook his head. "You're asking questions about a place you shouldn't be asking questions about." And then he walked away. Caleb spent the next week investigating everything he could find about the farm. Old property records, newspaper archives, water maps, even records from the county office. And eventually he found something strange. The original property map showed a structure that no longer existed. A small building was marked behind the barn. But when Caleb compared the old map with the modern property survey, there was no building there. It had disappeared from every newer record. Caleb returned to the farm. He stood behind the barn and measured the distance from the old well. 17 feet. He measured again. 17 feet. Then he remembered the first number on the rusted marker. 17. Suddenly the other numbers mattered. 4. 9. Could they be measurements? Coordinates? A date? He didn't know. But he knew one thing. There was something about that farm that didn't make sense, and that was exactly why he went to the auction. The next morning, Caleb sat among men who had farms larger than anything he had ever owned. The auctioneer started at $10,000. No one bid. $8,000. Nothing. $5,000. Still nothing. The price continued dropping. When it reached $2,000, Caleb raised his hand. The room went silent. Then someone laughed. "Son, you sure about that?" Caleb nodded. Another farmer leaned toward him. "That's the worst piece of land in Red Creek." Caleb didn't respond. The auctioneer counted once, twice. Sold. The room erupted again. But Caleb simply looked toward the window. He could see the distant hills, and somewhere beyond them was the farm he had just purchased. Everyone thought he had made the biggest mistake of his life. But Caleb was thinking about the old marker, 1749, and the vanished building on the property map. That afternoon, he drove onto his new farm for the first time. The silence was unsettling. There were no animals, no machinery, no workers, only the sound of wind moving through the dead grass. Caleb walked toward the barn. The doors groaned when he opened them. Inside were broken tools, empty shelves, and a layer of dust so thick that his footsteps left clear marks across the floor. Then he noticed something. One section of the wooden floor looked different. The boards were newer. Caleb crouched down. He touched them. The wood was less weathered than everything around it. Someone had replaced those boards. But why? He stood up and followed the floor toward the back wall. There was a small iron ring attached to one of the boards. Caleb froze. He had seen something like it before. It was the same type of ring used to lift heavy wooden trapdoors. His heart began pounding. He grabbed it. Pulled. Nothing. He tried again. The board moved slightly, then stopped. Something underneath was holding it shut. Caleb grabbed a crowbar from the wall. He wedged it underneath the board, and as he pushed down, he heard a sound from beneath the floor, a hollow metallic clang. Caleb stopped. There was something underneath the barn. But before he could pry the board completely open, he heard a truck approaching outside. He stepped away from the floor. Through a crack in the barn door, he saw an old pickup stop near the farmhouse. A man climbed out. It was the same farmer who had told Caleb to forget what he'd seen. The man stared at the barn. Then he looked directly at Caleb, and his face went pale. "Where," the old man asked, "did you find that?" Caleb didn't answer. Because he suddenly realized something. The man wasn't looking at the barn. He was looking at the exact floorboard Caleb had just tried to open. And whatever was underneath it, the old farmer clearly knew about it. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The old farmer slowly walked into the barn. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. "You shouldn't have opened that," he finally said. Caleb looked at him. "What's underneath it?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Did Walter ever tell you about the well?" Caleb's expression changed. "You knew about it?" "I knew Walter." "That doesn't answer my question." The old farmer sighed. Walter wasn't trying to fix the well. Caleb stepped closer. Then what was he doing? The old man looked toward the barn door. He was trying to find something. That sentence changed everything. Caleb remembered the old property map, the missing building, the numbers, the strange patch of green grass, and now the floor beneath the barn. What was he looking for? The farmer hesitated. Then he said something Caleb wasn't expecting, something his father buried. Caleb stared at him. Buried what? "I don't know." "You don't know?" "No one knows." The farmer turned toward the door. But Walter spent the last years of his life believing it was here. Then he left. Caleb watched the truck disappear down the dirt road. He could have ignored the warning. He could have sold the farm and walked away. But now he had a question he couldn't let go. What had Walter Hayes believed was buried beneath his property? That night, Caleb searched the farmhouse. He opened drawers, cabinets, closets, and old boxes. Most were empty. Then, inside a locked desk drawer, he found an envelope. There was no name on it, only 3 numbers: 17, 4, 9. Caleb's hands went cold. Inside the envelope was a faded photograph. It showed the farm almost 60 years earlier. The barn looked different. The farmhouse was smaller, and behind the barn stood the mysterious building from the old property map. But there was something else. A group of men stood beside it. One of them was Walter's father, and in the center of the photograph was a wooden crate. On the side of the crate was a symbol Caleb didn't recognize. He turned the photograph over. There was a handwritten sentence: "If they come back, make sure they never find it." Caleb read it twice, then a third time. Who were they? And what exactly had been hidden? The following morning, Caleb returned to the barn. He lifted the floorboard again. This time, he worked carefully. After several minutes, the board finally came loose. Beneath it was a narrow wooden shaft. It descended into darkness. Caleb lowered a flashlight. The beam revealed old stone walls, a hidden chamber. He climbed down. At the bottom, the air was cold and damp. The chamber was larger than he expected. There were shelves along one wall. Most had collapsed. Old tools lay scattered across the floor. And in the far corner was a metal box. Caleb walked toward it. The box was heavily rusted, but it had been deliberately placed on a stone platform. He reached down, then stopped. Something was written on the stone. 17 feet from the well. Caleb looked up. The numbers finally made sense. The marker hadn't been a code. It had been an instruction. He measured the distance, 17 feet. Then he found another mark, 4 feet from the wall. And beneath it, 9. The 3 numbers pointed to a location, not the chamber, something deeper. Caleb moved the metal box aside. Underneath it was a second trapdoor. His heart raced. He pulled it open. Nothing, just earth. For a moment, Caleb thought the trail had ended. Then his shovel struck something. Clang! He froze. He dug faster. The shovel hit metal again. Slowly, a large steel container emerged from the dirt. It was sealed, and unlike everything else in the chamber, it showed almost no rust. Someone had protected it. Caleb pulled it free. There was a faded name stamped across the lid, Hayes & Sons. He opened it. Inside were dozens of old documents wrapped in oilcloth, property deeds, maps, photographs, and one handwritten journal. Caleb opened the first page. It belonged to Walter's father. The entries described something that had happened decades earlier. The farm hadn't always been worthless. In fact, the land had once been considered extremely valuable. The problem wasn't the soil. It was what was underneath it. According to the journal, workers digging near the original barn had discovered an underground water source. A massive one. But they also discovered something else. A natural underground cavity running beneath the property. The Hayes family believed it contained valuable mineral deposits. They planned to keep the discovery secret. But before they could develop it, something happened. The journal suddenly stopped. The next page contained only one sentence. "We buried the evidence because they are watching us." Caleb's pulse quickened. He turned the page. A map was folded inside. It showed the entire property. A red line extended from the barn toward the hills. At the end of the line was a large X. Caleb looked at the date. The map was nearly 50 years old, but the most shocking discovery was written beside the X. The source begins here. Caleb immediately understood. The farm wasn't worthless. It had been abandoned because someone had deliberately hidden what was beneath it. But why? And who had been watching the Hayes family? Before Caleb could study the map further, he heard something above him. Footsteps. He turned off his flashlight. Silence. Then another footstep. Someone was walking inside the barn. Caleb stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped directly above the hidden chamber. A long pause followed. Then he heard the floorboard move. Someone was opening the entrance. Caleb held his breath. A shadow appeared at the top of the ladder. Then a voice whispered, "Caleb?" It was the old farmer. Caleb climbed up. The old man was holding something in his hand. Another photograph. "This was taken the night Walter's father buried the box," he said. Caleb took it. The old man pointed to the background. There. Caleb looked closer. 3 men stood beside the barn. One was Walter's father. One was the previous owner of the neighboring ranch. And the third man was the old farmer himself. Caleb looked at him in disbelief. "You were there?" The old man nodded. "We all promised never to talk about it. What happened?" The old man stared toward the hills. "We found the water." Caleb waited. "And we found something in the cave." "What?" The old man swallowed. "Gold wasn't the reason the land was abandoned." He pointed toward the map. The cave was unstable. Part of it collapsed, and Walter's father believed whatever was inside could destroy the entire valley if anyone disturbed it. Caleb looked back at the hidden chamber. So why did Walter keep searching? Because he didn't believe his father. The old man's voice dropped. He thought his father had buried something valuable. Caleb looked at the photograph again. Then he noticed something nobody had mentioned. Behind the 3 men was the old barn, and beside it was a wooden post. Carved into the post were the same 3 numbers, 17, 4, 9. But beneath them was another marking. A direction, an arrow pointing toward the hills. Caleb looked outside. For the first time, he understood why Walter had spent years searching the property. The buried box had never been the real secret. It was only a clue. The real discovery was somewhere beyond the barn, somewhere beneath the hills. And the next morning, Caleb took his shovel, the old map, and walked toward the place marked with the X. The same people who had laughed when he bought the farm would soon discover why he had refused to sell it. Because after decades of being called worthless, the land was finally about to reveal what had been hidden beneath it.